Hollywood showed the elegant lady stepping down from the stagecoach with a parasol and a smile. A lie. The reality of the women who crossed the West in stagecoaches was documented by the women themselves, in diaries, letters, and testimonies that stayed tucked away for decades. What they wrote about those journeys is hard to read. Watch until the end. Number 21 is the most disturbing. Number 1. On Old West stagecoaches, there were no scheduled bathroom stops. When nature called, the men would just get out or use a bucket right there. But for women, it was a very different story. Imagine trying to deal with that while wearing layer upon layer of clothing, a tight corset, and those huge hoop frames under the skirt. In practice, it was impossible. And what did many of them do? They stopped drinking water days before boarding. Days. On a trip that could last weeks under the blazing sun and constant dust. The result was predictable. Urinary tract infections, kidney problems, and severe dehydration became common among female passengers. Nobody talked about it at the time. It was considered improper. But medical records tell a different story, one that shows the real price these women's bodies paid just to make the journey. Number 2. Women traveled in tight corsets because society expected them to. Now imagine wearing one of those corsets inside a stagecoach with no suspension, getting slammed around in potholes for 12 hours straight. The result was brutal. Frontier doctors like George Holliday documented cases of broken ribs, fainting from lack of air, and even internal bleeding in female passengers. The corset squeezed the chest tightly, and every jolt in the road worked like a blow against ribs that were already under pressure. Many women arrived at their destination in worse shape than any cowboy injured on horseback. And the worst part was, taking the corset off was not an option. A woman without a corset in public was seen as indecent, so they endured it in silence. In this case, the road was not what did the most damage. It was the social code no one questioned. Number 3. Stagecoaches were built to hold 9 passengers, but in practice, they crammed in as many as 15. Imagine a woman back then, raised never to touch a man who was not a relative, being squeezed between 2 strangers for hours on end. The seats had no separation at all, and your knees would end up tangled with the knees of the person in front of you. Every hole in the road threw everyone into each other. Diaries from the time reveal that many women pretended to sleep through the entire trip just to avoid conversation and eye contact. Others cried quietly without being able to complain because there simply was no alternative. Some even paid double the fare trying to secure a window seat, which at least gave them one free side. The detail few people tell is that many men took advantage of those jolts on purpose, and nobody said a word. Number 4. Harassment did not even have a name yet. Back then, the word did not exist, but the behavior was routine. Inside a cramped stagecoach, where strangers were packed together for days, women dealt with hands that accidentally brushed against them in the dark, indecent whispers, and comments about their bodies made like jokes in front of everyone. Diaries from women who traveled across the West describe situations that today anyone would recognize immediately. But back then, if a woman complained, she was called hysterical or ill-mannered. Silence was the only option considered respectable. And the worst part? The drivers rarely stepped in because they did not want to lose paying passengers. So women learned to endure it in silence, gritting their teeth until the next stop. Number 5. Pregnant women traveled in those stagecoaches because they simply had no other choice. Soldiers' wives following their husbands, settler women heading to new territories. The problem is, that nobody talked about what happened to them during the trip? The constant shaking caused miscarriages, and that is not speculation. It is documented in records from the transportation companies themselves and in letters from the time. Some women went into labor right there inside the coach, in the middle of the road, with no doctor, nothing. The other female passengers did what they could, improvising as midwives. Babies were stillborn. Mothers did not survive childbirth, and the stagecoach did not stop. The driver had a schedule to keep, and neither birth nor death was reason enough to delay the route. Number 6. Think about this. A 25-day trip squeezed onto a wooden seat with strangers beside you. Now imagine going through that while on your period, with no disposable products, because they simply did not exist. Women used strips of cotton that had to be washed and reused, but washed where? Dried how? There was no extra clean water, and not a single moment of privacy. The result was predictable. Infections became routine on those journeys. And the most revealing part is the silence. No men's diaries from that time mention this subject. The ones written by women, when they dare to mention it, use coded language and disguised phrases. A kind of suffering that happened every month, in front of everyone, and that history treated as if it had never existed. Number 7. When a man died in some remote town out west, his widow faced a problem few people imagine. There were no trains on much of the route, so the only way to take the body back to the family in the east was on the stagecoach itself. The woman paid an extra fare for the coffin, which was tied to the roof or wedged in among the luggage. In some cases, the body even rode inside the coach, right next to the passengers. Imagine the scene. A grieving woman, stuck for days in a cramped space, surrounded by strangers who could barely hide their discomfort. The smell got worse at every stop. Nobody offered condolences because nobody knew what to say. Her grief did not get a single moment of silence or privacy. It was public, dragged out, and stripped of any dignity. And she still had to keep her composure, because any open display of pain made the other passengers uncomfortable. Number 8. Small towns in the West had a serious problem. They did not have enough female teachers. The solution was to recruit single women from the East, often through newspaper ads. They accepted the job, packed up their things, and set off alone on a stagecoach to places they had never seen before. The trip lasted for weeks through lawless territory. The disturbing detail is that their destination was public information. Everyone knew where they were going. Drivers, passengers, people at the stage stops. Some of those women simply never made it to their final destination. And the contracts those towns offered said nothing about what would happen if the teacher disappeared along the way. There was no protocol, no organized search. If she vanished, they hired another one. It was as if the risk of the journey was entirely her problem. Number 9. In the 1900s, cities like Chicago and Pittsburgh tried to ban long hat pins. Why? Because women were using those accessories, some up to 10 inches long, as weapons to defend themselves against abusive men. But that practice did not start on the streets of big cities. Decades earlier, inside stagecoaches, women were already hiding those pins as their only real protection against male passengers who tried to grab them in the cramped seats. With no sheriff around and no room to get away, the hat pin was what they had. And it worked. One stab to the arm or the face quickly handled what words could not. The most striking part is that nobody questioned the hat pin when it was only being used for fashion. The problem started when women began fighting back. That is when politicians wanted to ban it. The tool was the same. What changed was who got to decide how to use it. Number 10. A woman traveling alone on a stagecoach carried an invisible burden. Without a man by her side, she automatically became suspicious. Station owners treated that passenger like someone of questionable morals, a runaway, or even a prostitute. And that changed everything. Her food came last. The room she was given was the worst one available. And the other passengers felt free to make comments they never would have made in front of a husband. Many women quickly learned to protect themselves with a simple lie. They said their husband was waiting at the next stop. Some even carried fake wedding rings just to avoid trouble. It was not vanity, it was survival. Because back then, a woman traveling alone was not seen as independent. She was seen as available. And that rule was not written down anywhere, but everyone followed it. Number 11. In records left by Old West travelers, there are accounts of women who went into labor inside moving stagecoaches. In one of those stories, a passenger described in her diary how another woman gave birth right there in the cramped cabin with strangers all around her. The baby was born alive. The driver stopped for less than an hour. After that, the trip went on. The mother, still bleeding, was left at the next station with the baby in her arms. No doctor, no guaranteed help. The most disturbing part is the silence that came afterward. No official record mentions that woman's name. No one wrote down whether she survived or what happened to the child. To the stagecoach companies, it was just an unscheduled stop. 40 minutes behind schedule, nothing more. Number 12. When outlaws or native warriors attacked a stagecoach, the passenger's fate was divided in a brutal way. Men were usually killed right there or left behind with nothing. But young women often faced a different end. They were taken. It was not the exception. It was the pattern. Cynthia Ann Parker was captured at the age of 9 in 1836 and lived for decades among the Comanche. But her case became famous precisely because there were dozens of others no one remembers. Women captured along the routes out west simply disappeared from the records. And here is the detail most people do not know. The stagecoach companies themselves knew about that risk. They had internal reports about earlier attacks, and they knew which stretches were the most dangerous. Even so, they sold tickets to women traveling alone without giving any warning at all. Profit came first. The passenger's safety was her own problem. Number 13. On long stagecoach trips, stops were rare and decided by the driver, not the passengers. When the vehicle finally did stop, the scene was always the same. An open stretch of land with no facilities, not enough bushes, nothing. The men would simply walk a few yards away and take care of their business without a second thought. For women, the situation was completely different. They came up with their own system of protection. They formed a tight circle, lifted their full skirts like makeshift curtains, and took turns in the middle. One protected the other with her own body. That gesture shows up again and again in diaries from the time as the only real moment of female solidarity during the entire trip. Some women reported going all day without drinking water just to avoid that exposure, which led to frequent fainting spells on the hottest stretches. Number 14. Imagine wearing the same clothes for an entire week in 104-degree heat without bathing even once. That was exactly what women dealt with on stagecoaches. They traveled in heavy dresses, tight corsets, multiple layers of petticoats, and leather boots, and they could not change out of any of it. The reason was simple. The coach was cramped and shared with strangers, men and women sitting side by side. There was no curtain, no stop with a restroom, no privacy at all. Sweat built up under all those layers, and their skin started to suffer. Chafing showed up in the first few days. Then came open sores, infections that spread and could become genuinely dangerous. And the worst part is that nobody talked about it. They just endured it in silence because complaining was not an option back then. Number 15. The stations along the routes were places to switch horses and grab a quick rest, but for women traveling alone, they posed a real danger. These stops were in remote areas, run by men who lived in isolation for months, many of them with questionable backgrounds and easy access to alcohol. There was no oversight, no law nearby. Accounts from the time show that many female passengers preferred to spend the night inside the stagecoach itself, sitting cramped and uncomfortable, rather than accept a room at those stations. And here is a detail few people know. The Butterfield Overland Mail even circulated informal guidance, recommending that women simply not get off at certain points along the route. In other words, the company itself knew about the danger, and instead of fixing the problem, it merely suggested that female passengers avoid certain places. That says a lot about how women's protection worked in the Old West. Number 16. Many soldiers' wives faced a situation few people stopped to think about. The husband would be transferred to some isolated fort deep in wild territory and send a letter asking her to come join him. The problem was that the letter could take weeks or even months to arrive. In that gap, anything could happen: attacks, disease, accidents. The woman would gather the little she had, pay for a stagecoach ticket, and face weeks of brutal travel with no idea what she would find at the end. There was no telegraph at many of those forts. There was no way to confirm anything. And when she finally arrived, exhausted and broke, sometimes she was told that her husband had already been buried weeks earlier, with no money to go back, no one she knew, and nowhere to go. The stagecoach fare was expensive and only covered one leg of the trip. She was stranded in a place she had never chosen. Number 17. Here's something not many people stop to think about. In the Old West, a woman inside a stagecoach could be in pain, hungry, burning up from the heat, or terrified. And even then, she was expected to stay quiet. Complaining was seen as weakness, a lack of composure. Society at the time treated women's suffering as something they were supposed to swallow in silence. And the most striking part is this. When you read these women's diaries, written in private, just for themselves, many of them still apologized for being tired. They felt guilty for feeling what any human being would have felt under those conditions. That self-imposed silence helps explain why these stories stayed buried for so long. No one told them, because women were trained not to tell them. Number 18. There was a phenomenon that doctors at the time could barely explain. They called it Prairie Madness. Weeks confined in a cramped space, barely sleeping, going through things no one should have to go through. It broke the minds of many women. Some arrived at their destination unable to speak. Others screamed non-stop. And the worst part was that nobody treated it like an illness. The solution was simple and cruel. They locked these women in a back room at some boarding house or sent them back to their families as if they were damaged goods. Asylums in the West had wards full of women who arrived that way by stagecoach. In the records, there was only a cold note: disturbed upon arrival. No doctor's name, no diagnosis, no plan for recovery. Number 19. Many women kept diaries during the trip, but what they wrote there was not just simple descriptions of the scenery. They developed their own language, full of abbreviations and vague phrases that hid harsh truths. A note like, "A visit from Mr. M" could mean harassment. Indisposition was a common code for an unwanted pregnancy or a miscarriage. Historian Lillian Schlissel spent years analyzing these diaries in women's diaries of the westward journey and noticed the same patterns showing up in dozens of different accounts. These were not isolated cases. It was a silent system of record-keeping that let women document abuse without exposing themselves to the judgment of husbands, pastors, or neighbors. They knew no one would protect them, so they created their own archive of the truth, hidden in plain sight. Number 20. Many women wrote letters during stagecoach stops. They poured out everything, the fear, the discomfort, the humiliating situations they faced on the road. But when they reached their destination, they kept those letters and never sent them. They were too honest. Decades later, historians found those folded papers inside trunks, hidden among old clothes and personal belongings in attics. They were letters to mothers, sisters, childhood friends. In them, these women described things they never would have dared to say out loud at the time. Some told stories so harsh, they even apologized for writing them. These documents became some of the most direct and unfiltered records to survive from that period. No history book from that time tells what those letters tell. Number 21. Catherine Haun's diary, written in 1849 during the gold rush, was forgotten for decades. In it, she described in detail what women went through on those crossings: illness, childbirth on the trail, harassment from fellow travelers, and brutal decisions about who got left behind. Publishers refused the text in the late 19th century, claiming the content was inappropriate for women readers of the time. Her family kept the manuscript for generations. It was not until the 20th century that historians finally published it, revealing names, dates, and places the official version had always preferred to ignore. What she recorded did not fit the myth of the heroic West that Hollywood liked to sell. And maybe that is exactly why it was silenced for so long. The question that remains is simple. How many other diaries like this are still sitting in some basement, waiting for someone brave enough to open them?